Okay, I've went ahead and created most of the spreadsheet that I'm asking you to create for Lab 5, and I want to give you a tour of that, and then at the very end we'll create the histogram. I want to walk you through those steps. So first of all, the action's starting down here in the lower right. What I have is it's 10,000 rows starting at row 21. So here's cell C21. If I hold down Shift, Control, and then press down the down arrow key, that takes me all the way down to the bottom of this column, and I see that I go to 10,020. If I start at row 21, then I need to go to 10,020 to have 10,000 rows. And I have, in each of those rows, I have 100 random numbers between 1 and 8. And notice that to get a random number between 1 and 8, we type equals rand between 1 and 8. And all that does is gives you a random integer between 1 and 8 inclusive of those endpoints. We see that 1 does possibly show up. It shows up several times as well as 8. And then once you've done that, what you're going to do in column A is compute the sum for each row. So for example, whoops, didn't want to do that. In the cell A21, we have the sum from cell C21 all the way over to the right. Okay, all those 100 random numbers between 1 and 8. In the central limit theorem, we saw in the text, through one of the examples, it tells us that this sum is approximately normally distributed with a mean of 450 and a standard deviation of 22.9. So what we're going to do next, once we have all these sums, so you'll do it for this formula A, or this cell A21, then you can fill that formula down. Then we're going to calculate the mean and the standard deviation of those sums. So here's the mean, and you'll notice that it usually is very close to 450. And then the standard deviation, remember, we said should be about 22.9, and it also is going to end up being very close to 22.9 experimentally. Now to get the mean, you just use the equal average function and then type in a range such as, let's see, C21 to C23. Okay, whoops, it doesn't like something about my, oh I see, I forgot to type a C there. Press enter. And what that does is gives me the average of whatever numbers you put in your range. So these three numbers all happen to be 1, so the average came out to be 1. And if you want the standard deviation, you type equals STDEV. Now notice it gives you 4 options for standard deviation. We're going to talk about those different options later in the course, in the statistics portion of the course. But for now, I'll just tell you to use that STDEV function. And then whatever range you want the standard deviation of. If I wanted C21 to C23, then remember those are random numbers, so they're going to change. Their mean changed as well, and we see that their standard deviation in this case is about 2.51. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that we do to get this mean and the standard deviation. And then up at the very top, what I'm doing is counting the frequencies of various numbers for these sums. And I fairly arbitrarily chose to have this go from 350 all the way up to 550. Okay, so if I go all the way out to the right, I stop at 550. And below each of these numbers, from 350 to 550, there is a non-negative integer. And we have a 1 there. Most of these are zeros, and that's because these numbers are pretty far away from the mean for our normal distribution, which is 450. But if we go in more towards the middle, we see that the numbers start showing up more often. And there is the mean, 450, and notice that the frequency for 450 is 133, which isn't near as high as a lot of the numbers around it. That might be a little counterintuitive, but that's an effect of randomness. Even with the central limit theorem, even with all the stuff we study in probability, we can qualitatively, we can overall tell what's going to happen, and we can tell quantitatively, but we can't tell exactly. Okay, 450 is the most likely quantity, but hey, the results are fairly random, and 449 is pretty close to as likely, just a little bit less likely than 450. So what shows up in real life is always affected by randomness. It's just that we will see patterns when we have a large sample size. Anyway, got a little rambly there, sorry about that. And then when I go back farther away from the mean, 450, I start to see those zeros and 1s show up. So to get these numbers 350 through 550, the way I do it is I type the 350, and then in the next cell I add 1 to the previous cell. And then what I can do is fill that cell right. I think we've done that before in a spreadsheet. And finally, to get these counts. To get these counts, I'm going to use a COUNTIF function. Now what I want to do is graph this data in a histogram. So what I did was I pressed Shift Control and then the right arrow key. That highlighted the cell I was on all the way over to the right until the data ends in the column. And I'm going to press Insert, Column, and then 2D column. I'll click on this first value here. That gives me a nice histogram. Okay, and it's a histogram with very, very skinny bars, you'll notice. Now, the only thing I don't like about this histogram is it gave me arbitrary labels on the horizontal axis. It started at 1, whereas actually the first value over here was for 350. So I'm going to change that. And the way I'm going to change that is to right-click somewhere on the chart and select Data. And the horizontal label is over here. Okay, the horizontal category, axis labels, is over here. Notice that's where it starts at 1. So I'm going to press Edit, and then I'm going to click on A1, hold down Shift and Control plus the right arrow key. That takes me all the way over to the right side of the data. And those are my labels, so I'm going to press OK. Press OK again, and now my horizontal axis labels are correct. And we see that since the mean's at 450, this bell-shaped looking curve centrals out around 450. Okay, so what this is doing is for each number between 350 and 550, it's graphing how many of the sums out of the 10,000, let me put that graph over to the left. Okay, so it's a little bit easier to see, and you don't have to scroll all the way over to the right to get it. It's graphing the frequency of all these numbers, 350 to 550, out of our 10,000 sums. Okay, so that's what I'm hoping that you'll be able to do for Lab 5. Please do let me know if you have any questions.